Hello and welcome to the second video in our two-part series on wave power. In the first part, we discussed exactly what wave power is, some of the technology behind wave power, and how it can be implemented. Now, there are a lot of issues when it comes to wave power. And the second part of this is to look at exactly why wave power is not being implemented as much as other energy sources, such as solar, nuclear, geothermal, so on and so forth. And without further introduction, let's start discussing some of the issues that are facing the wave power industry. Now, the first reason why it's not being utilized nearly as much really comes down to a lack of design consensus. What this means is that there are multiple different ideas behind the best way and the best machine to create this wave power and electricity from should be. And with that lack of consensus, there is a lot of money being spent frivolously on different sources, and this lack of consensus is a big issue. And let's discuss why. So at first, it may not seem like such a big issue. In a capitalist economy, having innovation through competition is essentially one of our core tenets, meaning that having competing firms try and create the best design really gives the best end product for us as consumers. And let's just think about this. For example, someone may like drama television, or someone like me may really enjoy, say, YouTube documentaries. What this means is that there are different substitutes that people can look through in order to find something that matches their taste and preferences or wants. Now, when it comes to electricity, that's not the case. The only thing a person wants from electricity is consistent and convenient access to it. The different flavors and varieties of electricity doesn't matter. And electricity, as we know, is a commodity, meaning that its value is just intrinsic to itself, and it doesn't matter how this energy or electricity is produced, just as long as it is, right? No one's going to sit around and say, today I really hope to get my electricity from a wind power station with a windswept area of 200 meters squared. That's just ridiculous. And on top of that, it's not like you have electricity premium or electricity platinum, right? Electricity isn't a American Express card, right? You can't get the black card for electricity. It's just doesn't work like that. So really what we see is that there isn't a benefit to have alternatives to choose from, because what we really want to see is a, instead, collaborative effort occurring in a consensus around which design to utilize so that we can actually get access to this electricity cheaply and easily. And one thing to also consider is that institutions, usually governments, are the ones that purchase any type of electricity infrastructure. And a government isn't going to want to sit around and learn about all the different minutiae of the changes between devices and how a device has a different strategy to capture electricity as compared to another one, right? They don't want to learn the physics, and that's exactly why we need experts to come to a consensus so that we can look to them and say, okay, you're the expert. You've done all of these research and you've actually done testing. What is our best option? What's the cheapest option? And so on. And this is impossible to do if engineers are, well, fighting against each other and don't have a actual consensus to go to. This breeds confusion. In seeing how governments utilize taxpayer money, confusion isn't good. People want our money, our taxpayer money, to be spent in a way that will actually benefit us as citizens. And if there's any type of miscommunication or there's no kind of true definitive answer, governments would prefer not to spend that money, just like how people as ourselves would prefer our money not be spent. And another issue with not having a scientific consensus is that there's a lot of R&D spending that's going to be going to waste on trying to find alternatives instead of actually using that money to perfect a specific design. And that can be an issue. A lot of waste doesn't lead to concrete results. And let's be honest for a moment. We can't just sit here and say, all right, engineers, you have 3 years to tell us what the design consensus is going to be and what the strategy is. It just won't work. Because, for one, there's a lot of pride behind teams of researchers and engineers, and these people spend years of their life doing research and setting up businesses with the belief that they have the future in their hands, right? And what this really comes down to is that no one engineer is going to want to sit there and say, all right, you're correct, I was wrong, right? Instead, they're going to fall into multiple fallacies, going something like this. If only I had more time, I would show you that my machine works best. Or, I've dedicated my whole life to this research and I'll be damned if I give up now, and so on. And from a strictly business perspective, if a consensus is made such that a buoy-style device is seen as the standard and best option, then any company that has not been researching buoy devices and instead looking at a device that captures electricity through pressure differences coming from a transverse wave, then all those companies that didn't do buoy research are going to go out of business. And that's going to severely limit the amount of money that people can make. And again, people need money to live, right? People are not just going to altruistically sit there and design a product. People just can't do that, right? And on top of that, the mechanism for actually capturing green energy the most effectively and efficiently may not have been created yet. So imagine we come to a consensus, place a bunch of different infrastructure in place, and then find out in 5 years that a new design has been created that can capture electricity from the wave at half the cost and twice the efficiency. And when it comes to actually making a consensus, what makes it more difficult is the fact that wave power, if you remember from the first video, has two main variables that need to be accounted for and engineered around, which is wave height and, of course, wave period. And when it comes to, say, having more variables, there's going to be more complexity. If you're making a decision based on one factor and one factor alone, it's pretty easy. You can just rank it 1 to 5 and choose the one that has the better ranking. But if you're trying to make a decision around, say, 2 parameters, 3, 10, it gets exponentially much more difficult, and then concessions have to be made, where you have to say, okay, I'll give up this in order to have this instead, because I value this more than that, and so on and so forth. And let's look at wind power for a moment. When it comes to wind power, as you remember, the equation is 1/2 A area, P density, V velocity cubed, V cubed. What that means is that velocity is the only real parameter that you need to design around. And from there, the research is done only to maximize the amount of power that can be captured through wind. And when it comes to actually finding where to place these devices, all you have to say is, okay, we want to place these devices where the velocity of wind is the greatest. And the engineering that's going to be done is to more efficiently create blades that can maximize power capturing. When it comes to wave power, not only do you have to worry about wave height, but wave period, in designing around those two factors, in making concessions here and there. And you may have one team who's more interested in researching ways to maximize power production from differences in periods, or another one who's just trying to maximize in wave height, and so on. Anytime there's more parameters to design around or make a decision on, there will always be more complexity. And complexity, well, it complicates things. Now, with the above issues of trying to come to a consensus seeming quite bleak, I still think there's hope that a consensus and a collaborative effort will be reached. And for one, we don't just have to concede on one design. We can concede on multiple designs and say, okay, this design works best for really deep water. So let's go ahead and place that there. Excellent. Or you can say this design, on the other hand, works better for, say, shallow water by the shore of a beach, and so on. Meaning that multiple different businesses who have researched different devices can all get their cake and eat it too, allowing them to be successful and not have to give up all the years of research that they've done. And even if we do concede on one particular design, it's not like that's the complete end for businesses. Instead, what that means is that businesses can really focus on cost leadership and making the machine specialized for specific parameters or geographic locations. For one, you may have a business who designs buoy-style devices, which is a new standard, and they are instead focusing on really cold water areas. Or another company can be focusing on extremely volatile water conditions, and so on. And of course, there can be geographic monopolies forming, where some have a monopoly around the Alaskan regions, others are looking at the, I'll say, southwest seaboard, and so on. Meaning that you don't have to give up on innovation if you come to a consensus, and we get the benefit of having there be much more focused R&D spending on efficiency upgrades. And when it comes to a consensus and a collaborative effort forming, we need to realize that in doing so, it's not necessarily going to hurt actual businesses. Because you would think that if you come to a design consensus and that you're collaborating together, one company will reign supreme, where if your intellectual property is free to look at, then how can you have your advantage? And I don't think that's an issue. And I think we need to look at Tesla for this. And I know Tesla's like the company that everyone's talking about, but I can say they did this one thing right, which is they've issued all their patents that are free to available and free to use. And they have a pledge which basically goes that they will, and I quote, not initiate patent lawsuits against anyone who, in good faith, wants to use their technology. Meaning if someone uses their technology to, in good faith, create another electric vehicle or kind of electric type of transport mechanism using their design, they won't get sued. Meaning they have free and open access to that patent. And that's a fantastic example for the wind power, or rather wave power industry to follow. And Tesla obviously didn't lose any ground in doing so. They IPO'd at around $5 per share back in 2011, and 9 years later in 2020, their share price was around $2,200 before the 5-to-1 stock split. And they're on the S&P 500 now, which is no small accomplishment. In the green when it comes to money, so on. Now, by allowing people to use Tesla's intellectual property, electrical vehicles as a whole likely have grown much more quickly and become much more efficient than if those intellectual property and those patents were behind a paywall. And it did this all without damaging Tesla's profitability. And that's kind of what I just want to try and get at. Coming to a consensus won't necessarily screw over a lot of businesses. And collaborating together will help each individual business be more successful, benefiting us. Now, a lack of consensus and collaboration is not the only issue that the wave power industry has to deal with. Actually building these devices and placing them in the harsher environments of the ocean than when compared to building on land have all their challenges as well, or a new set of challenges making it more difficult than land building. To start, the ocean has an extremely saline solution, or it's really salty. And salt water, as we know, acts as an electrolyte, which essentially increases the rates at which ions in the metal jump off from the metal. Or in other words, this is known as corrosion. Corrosion is a big issue when it comes to water, more so salt water, which of course the ocean is salt water. And as expected, sourcing anti-corrosive metals or coming up with a new coating, like a zinc coating or something, galvanization, are going to be quite expensive and quite important. On top of that, there's a lot of regular upkeep and maintenance that needs to be done when you have these machines, since no matter what, there will be corrosion occurring at some rate. And that can be very difficult because these are giant not steel, but metal machines that are extremely heavy and immobile. And actually having to take them out of the ocean and clean them, that's got to be expensive. And indeed it is. On top of that, placing these machines in the ocean in the first place is going to require specialized boats and scuba diver workers, underwater welders, and so on, which are really dangerous and expensive jobs to hire people to do for you. And of course, you have algae buildup and pollution buildup as well, which can further increase the need for cleaning and maintenance. As we know, and as we have just read, building in the ocean is hard and expensive. Speaking of in the ocean building, there are of course environmental concerns that need to be discussed. For one, these devices act as fish aggregators for marine wildlife, meaning fish are going to congregate around these machines. And that can really disrupt the predator-prey dynamics in that relationship, where you essentially have created artificial refuge for prey. And that can, of course, lead to population distortions over time. On top of that, you essentially have big ropes that hold these machines down, and those can essentially capture and hold hostage a larger sea animal, of course, decreasing their ability to survive. Finally, these devices have oil inside of them and hydrofluids that need to essentially be maintained within the shell of the machine to make sure that they don't leak out into the ocean, because that can be a huge pollution problem. These machines also emit electrical pulses and noise, which can complicate the ability for predator species to communicate with one another or hunt. Where sharks, for example, are able to sense electrical pulses or changes within prey species, and if a giant device is essentially sending out a massive pulse, there's going to be confusion. And again, that's going to damage the predator-prey relationships. Now, there is another really big and interesting aspect to this that I'll probably have to make a whole new video on, which comes down to politics and lobbying. Just recently, as you know, the Green New Deal, as kind of bankrolled by Congresswoman Cortez, got shot down in the Senate back in 2019. But still, that marks a very massive shift to the desire for people, specifically of Generation Z and millennials, for green power. And on top of that, Joe Biden is recently talking about a $1.5 trillion infrastructure plan, which no doubt is going to implement green infrastructure spending, meaning that politics is going to be a massive frontier for sustainability and green energy in the future. And I think we need to go ahead and discuss lobbying, because there's been a lot of discussion about lobbying and corporate PACs and so on and so forth. And just in 2017, early 2018, during that midterm election cycle, giant oil companies, the fossil fuel industry, spent nearly $360 million on lobbying efforts, which is about 14 times more than what the sustainability and green energy lobby spent, where political allies of these oil companies are likely going to not be so aggressive when it comes to passing green legislature, meaning that these giant oil companies are going to be able to control the flow of when sustainability can actually become a top priority. And this isn't to say that necessarily oil companies are not planning for the future or that they're ignorant of the fact that fossil fuels are in decline, but again, to say that they want to have the power to decide when we can actually decide on having this green infrastructure. And personally, I don't trust all this green marketing that's being done by all these oil companies, or rather, I don't think that there's an altruistic nature to why these companies are saying that they're going to invest in sustainable energy. For example, I just got done reading BP, British Petroleum's annual report, or part of it rather, and there are pages upon pages written on sustainability, and they've made public pledges talking about how by 2025 they want to be spending $4 to $5 billion year over year on green energy, and they just claimed that also by 2025 they want to cut oil production by 40%. They want to cut it by 40% in 4 years. Now, this sounds great, of course, but who's to say that they can actually follow through on their pledges? Who's to say that they're not just doing this so that they can essentially capitalize R&D expenditures to make their balance sheet look a little bit nicer to hopefully allure potential investors? Clearly, the only way to ensure that these companies make well on their pledges is to have legislation in place to ensure that they're following up on these. But again, this kind of creates an endless loop where we need legislation to have these oil companies essentially make good on their promise to do green investing, but these giant oil companies are lobbying against that. I mean, there's a constant war going on. Now, let's just say for a moment that instead these oil companies are not lobbying politicians to not pass green legislature, but lobbying them so that they can receive juicy government contracts for their work, right? And to implement infrastructure and do the research. Now, An issue with this is that it leads to the formation of kind of oligarchies and monopolization, and that can stifle innovation and growth and make it harder for smaller businesses to succeed. Smaller businesses with more passionate teams who have better research and so on. Now, the only positive that can come from this is that the giant oil companies can utilize their infrastructure and economies of scale to actually implement, say, wave power, for example, at a much cheaper cost. In my opinion, however, there needs to be legislation in place to actually enforce green energy claims made by these oil companies. On top of that, tax incentives need to be utilized to make it clear that investing in green energy and sustainability from a company perspective will allow them to have greater profitability through essentially a reduction in their tax liability. Now, overall, wave power is a fantastic idea with a lot of potential, but it's clear that there's a lot of challenges that need to be overcome. In my personal opinion, I think first and foremost, a consensus needs to be formed. And then you start collaborating with each other to make one specific machine the standard, or multiple machines the standard in specific circumstances. Furthermore, it's clear that politics are going to play a very huge role in the advancement of sustainability and green energy. So we need to make sure that they're involved as well. Thank you all for watching. In my next video, I'm going to do a deep dive into green libertarianism, a political philosophy that I think lines up pretty well with my personal ideas. So we're going to discuss what it is, some of the principles behind it, and then of course bring up all the criticisms made against it, where I'm likely going to end up getting roasted, but I'm going to try my best to dissuade any of those claims and try and refute them. So it should be fun. Anyways, wave power can be the future. Probably not soon, but hopefully soon enough. Thanks.